All right, everyone, have a great meeting.
And thanks for coming to kick this off, even though you're out. And
Yeah, I
enjoy
didn't
your time
know.
off.
All right, thanks. Later, guys.
Bye. All right, does somebody want to drive? This is totally not my meeting, so I'm just asking.
Maybe I can try to drive this and so let's see what's on the agenda. So if you have something to talk, you want to talk about, please add an item on the agenda on the top under the topic. First, I can give some status update for the declarative application management. So me and Jeff is working on break some bad dependency of kube control. So declarative application management can use some kube control factory to build it with good dependency. So we are trying to make that possible.
Brian, you're muted if you're talking.
Or mic not working. Okay, so I sent mail to everybody saying we're canceled, and then I sent mail saying actually scratch that, we're on.
Thanks. Yeah. Is this better? Can you hear me now? Okay. I think that microphone didn't work. Yeah. So with respect to the kube control dependencies, there is actually a document that lists a bunch of the dependencies. I'll try to dig it up momentarily. I also saw there was another kube control in its own repo experiment by Matt issue added to the agenda. Do you want to talk about that and maybe we can compare notes?
Sure. Here, let me find, maybe I can share my screen real quick. So what I did was I was wondering how hard would it be to actually, to break things out. How hard would it be to break things out? And what happened was I said, all right, if I'm going to do this, why don't I just start doing the work and seeing what kind of roadblocks I run into? And so that's where I came up with this. And so let me know, where'd it go? Let's open up a new window. Let me bring that in. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So what I said was, what would I go about doing? And so I kind of wrote it down as I went. What I did was I started with the command kube control and I broke it out into its own directory. That directory lives in the Go path at ks.io/kube control because that's kind of the process we've gone through. And then I started to say, what do I need to make things just start working so I can start using the command, getting tests to pass, things like that. And so once I did that, I used dep, the package manager, to try to navigate all of the dependencies and figure out what I needed. I ended up using a make file to do a couple of additional things to that. And so let me show you what I ended up having to do, because it gives you an idea of the dependency tree. On its own, it just found two constraints really, client Go and Kubernetes. But I had to override a couple of things. One is Docker distribution. We're actually using something that's later than the latest released version in kubectl. And so I needed to say, grab it off the master in order to do this, because we're using unreleased features. And then there's Black Friday. Version 2 is out, and we're using the 1.x compatible version. And for some reason, dep didn't pick that up, so I gave it the override suggestion. There was that, but what that didn't deal with was the dependencies that are all in staging. And so what I ended up doing was a make file that actually, once it figures them out, then I actually trash the versions that are there, and then I copy them out of Kubernetes staging into the right space. And if you don't do this, you actually find minor compatible changes between the latest release versions that dep will pick up and what you actually have. There's some interface changes and things like this, and this just copies them out of Kubernetes and sticks them in here. This is actually the same code that Helm uses when they need to pick releases, although they do pin to a version of Kubernetes, and so they're copying the version out of Kubernetes in rather than off the tip of master, which is what I did here. And then what that ended up doing is it gave me something buildable. And then the next thing I said was, well, most of kubectl is actually in the package directory. So I actually took the package, Kubernetes package kubectl, and moved it into here in the package directory. And I had to do a little bit of renaming because it's going from kubectl to package. And so I toyed with renaming a little bit to make it work. And I made the whole thing buildable. And so it's got all of that there. The one gotcha is most of the tests don't pass, or a huge number of tests don't pass, because they're referencing things in the examples directory, the open API specs, and things of that nature. And I haven't actually decided, do I need to just link to them in the vendor directory? Do we keep a copy here? Do they go somewhere else? I didn't know the answer to that. I fixed a couple of them by just pointing it to the location in the vendor directory, and the test started passing when I said, okay, this configuration file's over there. Those started passing, so I proved that I could do it, but I wasn't sure on what the right path should be. But it's buildable. It actually works. It's just there's some test issues. Because it does Kubernetes, it's also worth doing go install if you're going to start running several commands. So that way it keeps pre-built versions of the packages and doesn't have to rebuild them every time. But other than that, it worked as a general path to break it out. And it even lets me see things like, what's the dependency tree? Here are all the dependencies that are actually in use in kubectl, to see, if things need to be unwound or something else. And I was looking to kind of get this picture as well.
Looks good, Matt. I know there's like 2 or 3 other groups that are doing vendoring of K8s because they're involved in splits. Have you talked to anybody else, or has anybody given you feedback on this approach?
And this approach, I took the same approach that Helm has been using because I'm most familiar with it. I haven't looked at what others are doing.
Okay, because I know that Service Catalog ran into parts of this, although they're trying to depend only on libraries. OpenShift, and there's a couple people on SIG API machinery who've been doing a lot of this recently for other components. You may want to send a general query for anybody else who's vendoring K8s and ask for support, because I don't think it should necessarily be on your head to support a particular way of vendoring K8s, even though this is a good way to make progress now. Because there's a whole bunch of like edge cases and ugly things like what you hit that definitely somebody should own fixing, if not this team.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the problems. I mean, a lot of this would go away of being an issue of even having to vendor K8s, even for Helm and others, if the upstreams were synced to the right place, because then you could just say, get it from k8s.io/API machinery rather than having to copy it out. That removes a lot of it. For some projects, that means they don't have to vendor K8s anymore. For kubectl, there's actually a number of links still, but I like the fact that actually seeing it here lets me identify where those links are. Let's see if I can find it. Because
I thought the metric server. So I'm sorry, not to
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
In terms of others, I also know that I thought Metric Server and Autoscaler were both importing various K8s dependencies, but I have to double check. They've been running a little bit longer, and they may have purged most of their dependencies.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's the same kinds of things that kubectl also ends up touching, which is common biz logic code that isn't moved out of K8s into a core repository or a library repository yet.
And this is the example. This line has all of the different things like package API legacy scheme, package API pod, package API ref. These are all used by kubectl from the K8s repository. It's quite a long list of them.
So let's say that to develop this and sort of start making progress and start snipping those, right? Would the action then be we would try and reduce that list that's out of the K8s.io Kubernetes repo, out of the mono repo, move those into separable repos, and then sort of change the dependencies to those? Is that the idea? But the problem is that there's this web of these things, right? And so you may have to both move something out, but then go through and update the Kubernetes vendored version so that they actually refer to the same types, right? Diamond problem. And now we've actually gone past semantic versioning when importing Kubernetes, because we have to now start taking an explicit version of Kubernetes. So it seems like the dependency dance gets really complicated if we, as we sort of play the movie forward of how we start breaking stuff out. Are there features that we could sort of, are there things that DEP could do to actually make this plan easier over time?
That's a good question. The person I'd want to engage on that is Sam Boyer. I think he's traveling this week, but he's the guy I'd want to pull into this conversation. Does anybody besides me know him? I'm happy to reach out to him and talk to him.
I talked to him like last week about some of this stuff, and he's trying to figure out sort of what is it going to take to sort of get Kubernetes on the DEP bandwagon. Yeah. And one of the ideas there, and I don't know if this is insane or not, is I think one of the problems is that for released versions, semantic versioning with its very linear type of stuff works great. When you're in active development, coordinating between dependencies across multiple things, it's like things aren't as linearizable as what you get with official releases. And so one idea and that I floated with Sam at the time was, what if DEP supported not only specifying dependencies based on versions, but also say, okay, head, but including this tag, where we actually have, like when you commit a version, you say this version now has, when you submit a PR, this version now has feature named X. And then when you specify a dependency, you say, I need something that has at least feature X, because then you can actually decouple sort of like the dependency tree based on when things get in versus some sort of strict versioning, right? So I don't know, I'm just throwing some ideas around there, because I think right now this is great, but then I'm trying to imagine, how do we move this forward, right?
Yeah, and some of this, yeah, I think you're right, is on unwinding it and how do you do it. When you have to unwind things, one of the things that I've learned from trying to help unwind some other monoliths in the past is it forces you to kind of take a package and put clear interfaces on it, and you treat it as its own thing. And so it actually makes the problem bite-sized with individual teams and being, when you actually have to take a whole feature in, you might have a few different PRs to different repos in order to do that, but it does make it a little bit cleaner to understand and to break apart and then to reuse if you're an outside consumer. Because that's just one of the things that we found was just breaking it down that way, making it easier. And if you break out things like kubeadm into its own repo and maybe package API, how much of this belongs in k8s.io/API? And if those things move over there, and then you start saying, okay, we're going to make the API, we're going to add these new things to the API, and then these other folks are going to go implement it. Maybe do that as alpha or betas or something like that using pre-release tags. And then there might be a strategy there to start making some of this work and breaking it up.
So Jeff, could you talk about some of the work that you've done on tracking down the kubectl dependencies and detangling them a little bit? I posted docs about that to the chat.
Yeah, we've got I mean, we've been looking at this for months now, and I think we understand the dependency problem. There's a lot of dependencies, and the most unpleasant dependencies are on the unversion types. What we want to do, the general approach, is clearly understand what parts of Kubernetes are intended to be vendored to the outside, what parts of the core are intended to be vendored to the outside. And then write kubectl in such a way that change kubectl so that it only depends on those things that are intended to be vendored. Then kubectl can, I have to close the door. Then kubectl can live in its own repo, and it's going to depend on those things that any other client would depend on, like client Go and API. And it's going to share code. We have a lot of code that Kubernetes uses that that kubectl uses that the core also uses. We have to put that into another repository, unfortunately, because when you want to split something out into another repo, you're going to have at least another one, a third one that has the code that is shared. And that's called common. We also have a utils repo that has some basic functionality, stuff that any user of Go might be interested in using. So the general idea, again, is first break bad dependencies. We don't have to move any code to break the bad dependencies. We just have to clean up those dependencies. And once kubectl depends in a sane way on packages that are intended to be vendored, then it can move to its own repository. And the work then is making sure all of the integration tests, the SKU tests, the upgrade tests, all the infrastructure around that still works. So lots of work to do. There's many issues filed about this. There's they're linked to in the docs that I think Brian just put out. So I don't think it's mysterious. It's just a lot of work. People have to start pulling things apart.
So the question in my mind though is that there's this assumption here that if we pull out a package and we put it in its own repo or we put it in one of these common repos, then it's frozen in time and it's done and it's good and then we move on. I think one of the
I don't think that's an assumption at all. It's not frozen.
Right. That's not the truth. So now it's like, okay, now we need to update one of those things. And so there's this question of how do we do iteration on those common packages in a way where you don't have to sort of create sort of multiple PRs that have to be coordinated and updated and merge tell because you have to rerun dep every time. That's the problem that I think we have. Now we could actually have those things like those common packages, iterate on major versions quickly, but that creates its own level of pain around this stuff. And so I feel like we don't have the right mechanism to be able to stage out these changes for rapid development. Now inside the mono repo.
Kubectl already depends on third-party packages, packages outside of Kubernetes, right? So that problem already exists in some sense. You don't control how that other code is evolving.
Yeah, but I think in general, though, the level of co-evolving that happens with those things is on a much slower pace. And so we generally, hopefully, don't take dependencies until things are to some level of calmness, in terms of our downstream dependencies.
Right.
Right? Whereas these packages, as we're refactoring, there's a constant churn rate along with these things. And right now, the tools that we have for managing dependencies and managing PRs are not built for churn across repos, right? And that's why we're doing the staging thing, because it lets us do one PR that updates 2 repos at once, right? But that staging thing doesn't work across repos either, right? So that's like a lot of the hacks that Matt had to make, right?
All of that stuff is true. It's a complex management problem, but none of it blocks breaking these bad deps. We can do that right now.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
So can I ask a quick question though on this? Why do we have such high churn in some of these packages, right? Why are some of these things iterating at such a high rate and not driving towards stability? I know we've had things like stability releases we're driving towards, things of that nature. So why is there such a high churn in some of these things, especially the things that kube control would need, things like API definitions, maybe some UI, some of these interaction things, I'm not sure why we have such a high rate of change. That's API breaking.
Because we're actively breaking these out and trying to still preserve the code, I think. I think it really comes down to no one has ever said, we are willing to just do two different things in two different ways in two different repos. And so short of that, every single one of these is like the refactor to gradually split them out. And so if somebody wanted to today copy the Kube repo and totally rename everything and drift and then cut its dependencies, we would not be having high rate of change core libraries because we would simply stop trying to share those. And that's the real trade-off.
Well, there's also the issue, like if you look at what we're trying to do with kube control to support extensibility and version skew and splitting it out into the separate repo, there's a lot of churn because we need to be able to do things like move some of the basic column selection for get to the server side, or we need to move away from unversion types to version types in kube control. And so kube control itself, as well as the API machinery, all have a lot of churn as we try to get to a place where someday we will have stable interfaces, but we're pretty far away from that right now. But I totally agree that conceptually all this stuff should stabilize.
Well, and examples of things that have stabilized, API machinery and API server and client Go and API are the four projects that have been stabilized and split out, but that took a better part
But
of
they're not really split out yet, right? I mean, like going from 4 to 5 with client Go, like I think it would be an interesting retrospective to look at all the breaking changes between V4 and 5 of client Go and figure out whether we really needed to do that stuff. Because I think like some of that is just gilding the lily. It's a very ugly lily. But some of it, I think, is just sort of cleanup and refactoring. But because it was easy to do sort of like highly coupled changes based on the staging directory, I think because it's easy, it was done, and because it was done in a way that didn't think about clients of client Go outside of the main
That's
model.
true. Drivers was reuse in things like the downstream service catalog. Like it was kind of like you could spend 2 years without changing anything and then we wouldn't be able to get to things like service catalog and metric server and some of the added tree, or we refactor to solve the same problems and keep everything at the same. It's basically like a trade-off of time versus
right. But I think there's a factor in that, which is the pain for people who are using client Go are SDK users, even though we don't have an SDK. And I don't think that actually is part of the calculus right now.
It's not. Client Go is not intended for third parties to truly not expect to get broken because it's being used. It has all of the same use cases that it did before it was split out. Like nobody's ever gone and said, we're going to not support these use cases by copying this code and just let it drift. We literally said, we're going to support everything we've always supported before. And the only way to do that was to do the kind of ugly factors.
So let me ask. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Just a question for Clayton. Client Go, does that tie together the Go types for decoding and encoding, or at least encoding, and the base dynamic client?
It does. We split API out into its own so that other projects could depend on it because we hit the diamond tree, because you can't compile the same binary that has two different versions of the API. And then there's no internal types in it, which is the big problem because we didn't want to expose internal types.
I would expect that most of kube control, once we move the basic get and describe code to the server and just have generic rendering in kube control, then most of kube control shouldn't actually need the types at all.
It should not need most internal types.
It shouldn't even need the version types, right? Like we shouldn't be round tripping the objects at all.
Well, I mean, yeah, we'd have to rewrite all the set commands though. The generic stuff is actually the ones that are mostly done. It's more the specialized commands like the the 50 or so non-get, create, update.
Right. Yeah.
I'm also worried about like other libraries that are not sort of the core client Go stuff. Like, are we going to evolve like, you know, the rate limiting libraries? Because it's like we've done that in the past and then fixed everything up and then moved on with our life. As we start splitting this out, that stuff is going to become that much more painful.
I
right?
think there's a question of what should our dependency updating model be? It definitely should be automated. It definitely should be automated, but what should the model be? Should it be a release and automatically update model, or should it be a test at green and automatically update model? Right?
I actually think that there's other things that we can do there. I don't think it's necessarily those are the other two choices. And that was the idea around, can we actually move to a feature tagged thing between major releases so that we can actually let a lot of stuff sort of be in flux, boom, cut a release version, delete the tags, and then move forward. Yeah, go ahead.
I did want to kind of raise, like, I think a lot of the, like, at the heart of it, your client SDK is a key point, which is we split client Go in a way that allowed people to build controllers, because most of the consumers at that point in time were things that wanted to move out of tree and be able to like split that out. Most people aren't building controllers, but it wasn't possible to do two ways of doing controllers. So it was kind of like a lot of the refactors have just been this very painful decoupling of the monorepo. If we're saying that we think that we want kube control to kind of be the edge thing, I mean, we could more aggressively copy. Like, I think that's kind of the trade-off here is the clean refactor is doing a lot of work in core Kubernetes and then gradually drifting. But if we wanted to accelerate it, one way to do it would be to copy the whole tree and say, this is now an isolated problem that kube control is drifting from upstream, and it needs to aggressively snip. I mean, it's basically you can either do it slower, you can rip the Band-Aid off. It's going to be more work. You're going to spend the same amount of time either way. It's how fast you prevent the new churn from coming into the system. Like, if you forked kube control hard today, copied all the packages, renamed all the packages, only reused client Go, only reused API, only reused API machinery, you would have a ton of duplication. People would have to fix bugs in two places. But in theory, or maybe not even in theory, you would force yourself into the spot where now you are drifting independently. And yeah, you wouldn't pick up automatic features from some of the core stuff, but you'd have to concretely make changes in order to pick that up. It would pull the Band-Aid off now. I mean, that's the other option.
So Ilya had an interesting idea. Ilya, do you want to talk about this, or can I read your comment? I don't know.
Yeah, please just read it.
Okay, so the idea is that can we move sort of the basic parts of kube control and then leave like the internal type stuff in the main repo, right? Could we lean on sort of like kube control plugins as a way to sort of, you know, break kube control out?
The one challenge is the factory. I mean, like, really the heart of kube control is the factory that provides the abstraction that lets someone say, like, I want to take kube control and add in new stuff without anybody else being aware. So it's really, the factory is just a whole bunch of interfaces that today pulls in the internal types. So you would have to cut
an effort to move it off. So API based.
I'm sorry,
Brian, you want to?
I was just gonna plus one this idea. So one thing we've been discussing is making the the client SDK idea was mentioned. We also need a server SDK for people building new APIs, whether CRDs or aggregated APIs or just separate APIs that are Kubernetes style APIs. More and more things want to use that API style in the ecosystem, as well as in the core project as we try to pull things apart. I think the generic parts of kube control are going to need to kind of go with the API machinery as sort of part of that SDK. So if you have Kubernetes style types, you can do generic create, delete, get kind of operations for anything that speaks Kubernetes types. So I definitely see us going in that direction where the basic skeleton is very general and doesn't have any domain specific commands at all. I would like to see that stuff move to plugins.
Can I ask maybe a slightly tangential, practical question here? Because we've talked about a few different ways that we can do things. And so I'm sitting here wondering, what will move end users towards practical things that they can, what will actually move the bar? right? If we spend a bunch of time untangling spaghetti code internally in Kubernetes, that's going to take a bunch of time. We're not going to be there. If we go in and we just rip it out in today, like kube control into its own repo and copy a bunch of stuff over and start splitting, what's going to actually move the bar? Where between these actually kind of gets us down the field towards our goal a little bit more quickly, because none of them sound ideal, right? None of them are this great world it's just gonna come across real well. So how do we get
Matt, is your
there?
question like what's going to add end value for end users versus just sort of be all stuff that's invisible behind the
To be
scenes?
honest, I mean, I think like maybe the underlying point we're saying here is that if you're using client Go today and you're not capable of keeping up with the changes, even the breaking ones, you're not being served by this and you want something simpler, and you probably aren't using all of the gravy. The gap today is that you have to pick up, somebody would have to do the work to pick up the new API types. So I think that's the simpler client Go SDK. I mean, like, I think at the heart of it, most people, to Matt's point, he's made this repeatedly, most people want a much simpler client than what we're providing. And if we're willing to pull that Band-Aid off to just say like Eric's simpler repository is one example, and just say, look, this is here, we're going to copy the types in and we're not going to break stuff ever, and you're not going to get new features for a year or more while some of these other efforts are going on, that might serve users better than them constantly having to change as we continue to try to split out pieces. Because there is going to be a huge amount of duplication between kube control and the core libraries. And it's going to take a year to refactor the majority of that. And it's probably not duplication that the kube control guys on their own can fix. Like, I don't have any desire to go patch in 2 places, but I think most of us will do some of that until it gets to that point if we took the more dramatic option in the short term.
But that's also client Go, right? That's dealing with the Go SDK. Maybe here's another question is, do we have enough people contributing to kubectl? And if we broke it out into its own repo more quickly, would we get more contributors to it and then therefore be able to drive its development more quickly? Like those kinds of things. It's a contributor experience thing, because if we spend a long time, there's only a handful of people who are really going to dive into this problem. There's a whole lot of people who are just not comfortable diving into PRs in Kubernetes, doesn't matter what part of it is. But if you had a simpler thing, here's a client that talks to APIs, a lot of people are going to be comfortable with that. Is there actually a space where we can now get more people contributing to that because they're more comfortable with the contributor experience and they're willing to help move it along further?
Why do you think they're not comfortable in Kubernetes, Matt?
Oh, because a bunch of people have told me that. Right? In general, they're like, Kubernetes, I've tried, I've run into so many barriers. I'm just going to be hands off because I don't want to deal with that now. Like, I've repeatedly had people tell me that. And some people, see, here's somebody who's new, who's given a thumbs up to this comment. So there's a real person. Kubernetes is daunting.
I would say that's like, if we do this, there's 2 benefits that we get out of it. Is that it's a down payment on really going down the path towards an SDK. And I think that there is that idea of I think we're going to see more velocity with kube control if it's broken out. We can have a smaller focused group that can just get shit done.
What do you mean by broken out? Because moving stuff, copying stuff to another repository doesn't magically solve any problems, right?
Well, so at the end of the day, I think there's 2 problems here. There's unlocking velocity in terms of contributing to kube control, moving it into its own project with its own pace and its own set of people. Like right now, I'm sure there's a ton of fit and finish that we can do with kube control. People are building tools around the edges for this thing.
Okay, so that would be true if what you're saying is true, I think, if you started from scratch, building a new kubectl that talked to the existing API only to the public and only vended in public code. Then you would unlock a lot of new development because they would not have to face the problem of why that Clayton was talking about. Why does the factory bring in the unversioned types?
Well, but I think regardless of, I think we could do a new kube control where we start it from scratch. That's probably not a good idea. We could duplicate a bunch of stuff. It'll be messy. There'll still be problems, but there'll be
there'll still be problems. You will carry everything that everybody's talking about, that Genevieve is talking about.
But you're no, you're not.
I think you're misunderstanding why people find it daunting, and we can ask Genevieve like why. But like, I think some of it is the code, and some of it is just like there's so much churn, there's so much noise, there's so much stuff that's going on in KK that it's very difficult to even get started and figure out how do I build stuff.
Can we articulate this as what we're saying is worse is better? right? I think this is a worse is better decision, which is we're saying we're willing to give up some of the advantages and streamlining that we have in the current model and deliberately work at a faster, less coarse pace. And we think that the end result for Kubernetes users will be better. Even like there's a lot of, to Joe's earlier point, like there's a lot of, I don't want to say gilding the pig, but there's a lot of internal due diligence that happens that may not be strictly useful to an outside person that is accumulating complexity and refining complexity that exists, which helps, but you could also say that like to the outside consumer, none of it matters. Like whether get.go is hacky or not hacky is irrelevant as long as it does what someone uses. And so some of that is there. Yeah, Guinevere, if you want to speak up, please.
Hey, I'm Guinevere, everyone. Hi. I unmuted. Success. So I honestly have just some really big concept issues with contributing. So my coworker, Aaron, sent me over to Kubernetes just to find like a simple spell check typo PR to start against Kubernetes. And it took me several hours even just to get set up there. First of all, there's the legal issue, which I'm sure is important. That was tricky. Then I had some issues with my Linux Foundation account, which you need to have, which is very inflexible and you can't delete them. And I was getting, part of it was my fault because I had 2 accounts because I made a mistake months ago, but that was hard. And I will say that the help desk was super responsive and super fast, but there was still just administrative stuff to wade through. Then a lot of the how to contribute docs are located in Kubernetes community, and it literally took me 4 links deep to find out, hey, what even is the process of contributing with GitHub? Now I'm pretty comfortable with GitHub, but that's not necessarily the case for other people who are new to open source, who don't use GitHub. The whole fork and clone thing is very, very natural to me, but I don't know if that's the accepted course of workflow, that sort of thing. And there is good information in there, and there's good diagrams for how to deal with this, but they're hard to find.
Okay, yeah, it would be good to, do you know that we have a contributor experience special interest group?
I do.
That also, yeah, so these sound like general issues for the project that would be no different regardless.
Correct.
It definitely should be moving kube control to its own repo, but none of these problems would be solved by doing that.
No, some of the other problems might be solved though. For example, how many folks know that you have to have a build file in every directory and what needs to be in that because we're using of the tools we're using. If we broke kube control out, do we actually? But if we break kube control out, do we still need those kinds of extra things for the CI pipeline?
Those are questions that we should be asking, right? Like if we use the same build tools and we use the same submit queue and we use the same everything else, that moving the code doesn't address any of those things. Those are kind of independent issues. We're still going to have a CLA. We're still going to have integration and end-to-end tests. We're still going to have all these things.
Yeah, I think that's actually a hurdle in a sense is like even splitting out kube control has to be tested very similar. And so like there's an evolutionary process. Like if we did like a harder short-term split, we're still going to have all of the same pulling it in. Otherwise, kube control is just going to go off into the wild for 6 months or a year and then come back. So there is some level of like we can accelerate some parts, but not all.
Yeah. And the question is, but afterwards, you can start to iterate independently of those problems. You can have a CI setup that's appropriate for kube control, but may not work for something like Kubernetes itself. Right.
Well, we use kube control in the E2E tests. So like there's some of those, like the couplings, like how would we split those? Like, I don't want to dive too much, but it's like, I think some of the coupling is if kube control goes off and we write a new kube control, that is the easiest way to reason about all these problems, which is, there's just this separate thing that tests against Kubernetes completely independently. How many of the cuts are we willing to break between the current project and kube control? Is it half of them? Is it all of them?
So Oh, am I unmuted? So I don't know if you guys noticed, but Federation got pulled out of core. They did a big PR where they deleted all the Federation code, which was pretty fantastic, and gave me hope that extracting kubectl is possible. So
although to be fair, that was because we're
I'm going to
basically
put the camp where I pull it out carefully, not copy the whole thing out. I think we're going to learn. I think I'm learning, and I think Menchie and the people that I'm working with are learning. We're improving the internal APIs, the way the sort of what I would call the internal APIs, the internal libraries are, how they present themselves and how they're used. We're understanding where the code divisions are. If we copied everything out, we wouldn't have any of that understanding. We would just have two messes instead of a better understanding of how the existing library should work. As we extract stuff into common, for example, we're learning what are those pieces that are used by multiple things, not just kubectl, but kubadmin and other CLIs that you might imagine writing.
I'll note that the Federation split was also Federation made a decision that they're not going to make any major improvements to Federation for 6 to 9 months. And so that simplified some of the calculus there.
Yes.
Would you be willing to give up short-term kubectl improvements in order to do this?
I have something to add, actually. Just sort of, it seems like perhaps the actual problem that we have is that kubectl is just essentially really tightly coupled to a lot of things in the main repo, and it's not like a it's not like a pure client, right? So if we were to put it into a separate repo and make it a pure client as part of that make a lot of sense. And having it in a separate repo, would stop anybody from adding any new code that depends on something that is internal.
So you can do that right now. We have build rules in place to make this thing a pure client. Moving into another repo does not magically make that better. It's something you can do right now with build rules and import.
I just think that there's a social aspect to having it be in a separate repo. I think if
I want it in a separate repo, but I'm just saying.
No, but even if we still have a hairball, but it's a hairball in a separate repo, there's still a social aspect of like ownership. There, you can form a smaller group that feels ownership over that thing, moving it forward. It's much more aligned with this SIG versus sort of like we don't have a strong relationship between SIGs and directories right now. That's something we need to fix. But like there is a stronger relationship between some of these repos that are broken out in SIGs.
Yeah, I think the number one issue that needs to be solved, which is underway, but I think Clayton can speak to how people could help with it, is actually get and describe. Like every single API field, every single API that gets added has code specific to that change and get and describe more or less. Right. So if we can have the just the selected contents of the API returned by the API and have generic rendering code in kubectl, then you don't have to touch kubectl every time an API is touched. And we have to do that anyway in support of versions queue, in support of extended APIs. So we need to get that. And it's going to take a few releases because of our versions queue policy, even after we have that support in the server, to remove the current get and describe code from kubectl. But in my view, we can probably look and count the number of lines changed. That's probably a lot of it is in that code.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Brian, do you think that would be made, that problem? That's a very important problem to solve. Do you think that would be made easier or harder by copying all of the code into the new repository right now, and then sort of working on it in two places?
Well, it might actually be a little bit easier because it would stop the flow of new. Well, I think the hard part is effectively to fork the repo today, you'd copy most of Kubernetes, and you'd start deleting stuff. And I think that's really it's a scary thing knowing how big Kubernetes is, and it would create that upfront barrier until people had gone and hacked away a lot of this stuff. There's like 2 or 3 projects that are, like I could think of 2 or 3 projects that are doing similar things to this right now. Like OpenShift is doing this with some of its components. And it's very daunting until you get the cut going, but the end result is something that does feel more isolated And I think, Joe, like I could make the argument that if we did this, it would stop the churn and it would make it more appealing, but it would definitely delay the incremental value you're getting for a little bit longer term, right? Like you're not going to get you're improving the core cube and cube control at the same time right now with the work that's going on. If we made the cut, we would have to accept a few months of
So I have a question.
Who are these people that are going to do this work?
Well, that's
a
one
good question.
My other question is, do we have a circular dependence problem? Like if we vendor Kubernetes into kube control, we have to vendor kube control back into Kubernetes.
It would make the cut for builds. I mean, the build system would have to start pulling in a dependency for somewhere else.
Well, so the last time we pulled,
why would Kubernetes have to depend on kube control?
It's used in a lot of end-to-end tests.
Right. But it doesn't need to build it. It just needs to have a binary, right? And like
it needs to pull in a binary from another.
We can have the test. We can have the test stuff pull in both of them, right? But like that seems like that's a clean dependency.
We would need to get there. Yeah, I think that would be a desirable end state. So one problem we've had in past times we've tried to pull anything from anywhere else is that it creates a significant percentage of flakiness. So somebody would have to put a concerted effort into mitigating that.
What do you mean, like pull binary or
cloning from GitHub is not reliable. Pulling binaries from other sources is not reliable. Somebody needs to go build a retry loop or something.
Can I make a suggestion here? If we want to go do this sounds like it's not our problem to solve, but a SIG test infra, right? So I will take the action to reach out to their list and ask about this problem and poke one of their leads. How about that?
I think that's fine. There have been a lot of discussions about this. I think everybody was kind of waiting for the first. We're playing chicken with the split train on this, which is it's going to be painful and everybody knows it, and so everybody's kind of waiting for the first victim. If kube control is kube control is going to be the first victim. I don't know that anybody else is closer, and so this is something that a test infra discussion would be good. I actually want to go back to Joe's point. What we've kind of done up till now is there's been a set of core contributors to the project who did a lot of kube control work, and then we kind of broadened it out, and that membership is turned over a little bit. And so we still have people who have been involved in kube control but are busy on other stuff. And so the end result is, if we want to grow kube control to be a new permanent team that's not kind of being rotated through by some of the original, contributors, we're going to have to do some things to concretely get people from the community, and that's going to come at an upfront cost without the promise of reward. I mean, I think that's the risk, is are we willing to take the risk of trying to force this into a scenario where we are accessible to new people and accept that we will get less and do less in order to make that happen. I mean, it's not an engineering calculation. It's a open contribution calculation. And we've hesitated to do that in other places in the project. I'll say that. It has gone very slowly.
All right, I got to drop. It's 10 o'clock.
I do too.
Yeah.
As far as the contributor experience and stuff with this first thing, I'm one of those people who said, who will do it? I'll help.
Great.
And that's where I'll leave it. Bye, Joe.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody.